The English Defence by Raymond Keene. Today I would like to introduce you to a new black defence. You won't find it in any books on chess opening theory, apart from a brief mention in my own book on the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack, which was recently published by Batsford's. Now, this tape is going to be divided into 4 parts. The first part, I'll talk about the ideas behind the defence. In the second part, I'll justify the title I've given it, the English Defence. In the third part, I'll go over 2 games that I've played with the defence in recent tournaments and matches. And in the fourth and final part, I'll go into some more detailed analysis to justify the theoretical soundness of this defence. Now, first of all, I'll give you the basic moves at the beginning. Please set up your pieces. White's first move is white pawn on d2 to d4. Black's reply is pawn e7 to e6. White's second move is pawn on c2 to c4. And now comes the key to black's defence, pawn on b7 to b6. Now, as I said before, the only book in which you'll find this defence mentioned is my own book on the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack, which is 1 b3 by white, and I give this defence a brief mention in the final chapter, but it's only a fleeting reference, and most of the important theory in this line has been elaborated since that book was written. Now, one of the things I like about this defence is that it shows the richness of the game of chess. Now, even as long ago as 1927, Capablanca was talking about chess dying through the death of the draw, and ideas being played out, and no new possibilities in the opening. And this is a fear that's been voiced again and again since those days by players who've become disillusioned with the game. But now, here we are, after 2 moves, a completely new defence, not documented properly in any theoretical works, with lots of scope for your own ideas and innovations. Now, let's try and give it a name. Now, the title of the tape is The English Defence. It may sound a bit presumptuous to adopt this title, but I think there's good justification for it. In the last century, the Reverend J. Owen, a strong British master, regularly played as a black defence 1 black pawn on b7 to b6 against any white opening move. Now, let's put the pieces back in the start position. For example, Owen's opponents almost invariably played 1 white pawn to e4 on the first move, and Owen replied black pawn on b7 to b6. Now, you can already see that there's a big similarity between the defence that we're going to discuss and this defence of Owen's. The trouble is that the Owen defence proper strikes me as giving white a little too much freehand in the centre. For example, white might continue on his second move with pawn to d4. Black could play bishop to b7. White would play bishop from f1 to d3. Black pawn would go to e6. White knight comes to f3. Black attacks the centre with c5, pawn to c5, and white plays c3. White pawn to c3. Now, this is a basic position of the Owen defence proper. The Reverend Owen used to play this kind of position frequently and with some success. He once even beat Morphy as black in this kind of position. And in our own times, Michael Basman has played a lot of games with it, and so has Bent Larsen. The trouble is that white's been able to support his centre very efficiently with the pawn on c3. And although the black position is doubtless playable, it strikes me that black will have a lot more difficulty in undermining the white central pawn structure than he does in the comparable positions from the English defence, where the white pawn has already come to c4. Now, we can see that the genesis of the English defence lies in the theories and ideas and games of the Reverend Owen. Now, this is one basic reason for calling the defence the English defence. Now, let's go back to the start position again, and we'll set up the basic position of the English defence. Please return the pieces, and now we'll play 1, white pawn to d4, black pawn to e6, 2, white pawn to c4, black pawn to b6. You can also see that this English defence is a good weapon against the English opening, which is 1, white pawn to c4. Black can reply with either pawn to b6 or pawn to e6, and then if white plays pawn to d4, he can choose the other move that he hasn't played yet, for example c4, b6, d4, e6. And once again we have the starting position of the English defence. Now I'll proceed with my justification for the title. A couple of years ago, Tony Miles started to play this defence in important tournaments. He once won a game against David Bronstein with it. That was at Teesside, the Alexander Memorial in 1975. But it seemed to me that Miles didn't handle the opening in exactly the correct manner. For example, after white played his knight to c3 on the third move, Miles would play bishop to b7, white pawn came to e4, forming a large pawn centre. Miles played bishop to b4. In the Bronstein game, the Russian Grandmaster played his bishop to d3. And Tony captured on c3, check with his bishop. White took back. And then Tony played something like black knight to e7, just playing a normal middle game position, where white has the double pawns, but also more space in the bishop pair. And it seemed to me that the right way to play this defence was not to play it slowly and positionally against the double pawns, but to strike more rapidly against the white centre with the thrust black pawn on f7 to f5. Now, let's go back again to the basic position. All the pieces on their starting squares, but with white pawns on c4 and d4, and black pawns on e6 and b6. Now, during 1976, I gave a lot of thought to this opening variation, and I discovered many new ways for black to play it, involving the thrust f5, as I said before. In some cases, even the surprising move, black queen from d8 to h4, striking sideways at the white pawn centre. And I started to employ these ideas in my own games with great success. Later on I told some of these ideas to Tony Miles, and he started to use them too, in the new way. And one of his very good games with this opening was his game against Farago, the Hungarian Grandmaster, from Hastings earlier this year, where he used one of my ideas to win very convincingly with black, and very quickly. So, we have a situation where the Reverend J. Owen, an English player from the last century, provided the basic inspiration by adopting the defence b6, although against e4, and then the two English grandmasters, Tony Miles and myself, started to play this defence, not against e4, but against d4 and c4 as white's first moves, in international tournaments. And impressed, I think, by our examples, Michael Steen and Bill Hartston also started to play b6 in their own games. Now, I think already we have a fairly clear justification for calling the defence the English defence, but earlier this year, Leonard Barden, the famous chess journalist and chess correspondent of The Guardian, rang me up and told me something that I hadn't before appreciated. This was that the English player P.N. Wallace had been using this defence in the 1950s and 1960s in the British Championship, and also with a fair degree of success. Now, Wallace's games weren't known to me at all, and later on I found a few of these games, And it seemed that already in the 1950s and 60s he understood the correct strategy for black, striking at the centre with f5, and also he'd appreciated the strength of queen h4 in certain positions. The trouble with Wallace's games is that they didn't make any impact at the time. He wasn't playing them in extremely important tournaments, and he had no effect at all on international theory. Whereas the games played by Miles and myself have certainly been noticed the world over, and been remarked upon by people like Larson and Timon in their own magazines and newspaper columns. So I think the fairest thing is to make a compromise. To call it the Owen defence is wrong, because Owen's defence is simply b6 against e4. To call it the Owen defence deferred, as I did in my Nimzovich-Larsen attack book, is also not entirely correct, because, once again, the association with the Owen defence is by optical resemblance rather than actual playing examples, and also simply to call the defence something deferred is a little bit vague and not terribly satisfactory. To call it the Wallace defence is also wrong, because although Wallace was perhaps the first person to play it in the correct form, we really didn't know about his games when we were reinventing the defence, and also he wasn't playing it against the strongest class of opposition in serious tournaments. And to call it the Miles or Keene defence would also be presumptuous, in view of the example of Wallace in the 50s and 60s. So I think that to come down as a compromise and call it the English defence is the fairest and most satisfactory method. I hope you'll agree with me, because in the further course of this tape, most of the games I'll be quoting are games by English players against foreign opposition. Well, that's introduced our new defence. Now, let's play over an illustrative game which I won in 1976 against Andrew Whiteley. Andrew Whiteley had the white pieces, I had the black pieces, and it was played in the National Club Championship match between Cavendish, Whiteley's club, and Cambridge, my club, I think in about April of last year. Have you got the pieces in the starting position? Okay, let's shoot. White's first move, pawn to d4. Black played his pawn to e6, and White played pawn to c4. You can see that White could obviously have transposed into a French defence by playing his pawn to e4 on move 2. Then I wouldn't have risked playing b6 on the second move, because that would be the Owen defence proper, which, as I said in the introduction, I don't trust very much. I would certainly have played a French defence in that case, although if you like the Owen defence proper, there's no reason you shouldn't play it. I think it's a very playable defence, but I don't like the cramp that afflicts Black's game in that case, although I know that Michael Basman has had a lot of good results with this kind of position, and so has Larson. Okay, White's second move was pawn to c4, I played pawn to b6, and now Andrew played pawn to e4. You see that White has the broad pawn centre, but he can't defend his pawn on d4 with the pawn on c3. There's already a kind of looseness and weakness about the centre which Black can exploit. My third move was bishop on c8 to b7, and Andrew played bishop from f1 to d3. Now I played pawn on f7 to f5, and I suggest that you switch off for a minute and think about this position. The main question you have to ask yourselves is what happens if White plays pawn on e4, takes Black pawn on f5. Switch off now and think about it. Obviously, after White plays pawn e4, takes Black pawn f5, Black has to play bishop b7 takes White pawn g2. White now plays his queen to h5 check. Black pawn has to go to g6. That's forced. White takes on g6 with his pawn. Black now has to play his bishop from f8 to g7. White takes on h7 discovered check. the black king has to go to f8. White captures on g8, making a queen or rook check, and black takes back on g8 with his king. Now stop and think about this position for a while. The point is that black will inevitably win the white rook on h1, and he'll come out the exchange ahead. Now, this is very similar to a well-known position that can arise from the straight Owen defence, that's e4, b6 on the first move. The difference here is that black already has a pawn on e6, and white has a pawn on c4. And that's a very big difference, and it's in black's favour. One point is that the pawn on d4 is less easily defended by white. The second point is that the white bishop on d3 no longer has the possibility of coming to c4 with check. A third element in black's favour is the ability of his queen to emerge more freely on the king's side. And this position with the pawns on e7 and c2 is unclear, but with the addition of the pawns on e6 and c4, it's certainly in black's favour. It's very complicated, and you can analyse it for a while if you like. In fact, I advise you to analyse it, but black should win in my opinion. Okay, now let's return to the game. Please put white's queen back on d1, put the black bishop back on b7 from g2, replace black's king on e8, put the black bishop back from g7 to f8, and now put the black knight on g8, and now the pawns. Black pawns on f5, g7 and h7, white pawns on e4 and g2. So black's just played f5 and it's white's move. He defended his pawn with knight c3, white knight to c3. Black bishop came from f8 to b4, and now Andrew played pawn on d4 to d5. That's quite a logical move to smash the action of black's fianchetted queen's bishop. He's trying to place a barrier in the way of the bishop, close it out of play completely, and thus refute black's opening. But now black has one of these strange manoeuvres involving queen h4 that I mentioned in the introduction, that puts very unpleasant lateral pressure on white's game. I hadn't actually analysed this particular variation before the game, and I had to find the following manoeuvre over the board, but it's a very good manoeuvre, and black now gets the advantage by force. If you like, you can switch off for a while and try and work out what it is. I've already given you a big clue that involves the move queen h4. Well, what did you find? The right variation goes like this. Black pawn on f5 takes white pawn on e4. White must recapture with the bishop. Now, the natural move is knight f6, attacking the bishop. But much stronger is queen from d8 to h4. Black still wants to play knight f6, but he gets his queen on the action side of the knight before doing so. Now white has to watch out. If he moves his bishop back to f3, the pawn on c4 is hanging, and if he moves it to d3, the pawn on d5 is going to fall. So Andrew decided to defend his bishop. Queen from d1 to d3. Black pawn on e6 takes white pawn on d5. White recaptures. White pawn on c4 takes back on d5. And only now knight f6, hitting the bishop once again. Note that white's never given any time to play knight f3, chasing off black's queen. White retreated his bishop to f3, and now black gained another tempo, bishop from b7 to a6. The white queen came to e3 check, and now black gets some more time, king from e8 to f7. Very good move. Castling's not important here. It's much more significant that the rook comes into play quickly on e8. Now, if you like, you can analyse natural developing moves for white in this position, something like knight on g1 to e2, but you'll soon find that after the reply rook from h8 to e8 that white succumbs to a vicious attack. I'll let you look at those lines yourself. Please put the white knight back on g1 and black's rook back on h8. Instead of this, Andrew decided to seek an endgame. He played his queen from e3 to f4. I checked him on e8 with my rook. Now he didn't like the look of putting a piece in the way, getting into a nasty pin, so he played his king to d1. White king from e1 to d1. And now I transpose into a winning ending, where white has weak pawns all over the place. First of all, I exchange queens. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Now bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Black pawn on d7 to d6. And it's quite clear that white has no defence to the move bishop from a6 to c4, which picks up the weak pawn on d5. Admittedly, white has the bishop pair, but in this closed block position they're virtually useless. This is already an overwhelmingly won position for black. But I'll give you the rest of the moves fairly quickly, just making brief comments on the way. It's interesting, by the way, that black can get a winning position quite so quickly from this new opening, and it shows how dangerous a surprise weapon can be. White's move, knight from g1 to h3. I didn't like the look of knight g5 check, so I played pawn from h7 to h6. Incidentally, that contains the threat of pawn from g7 to g5, followed by pawn to g4, winning a piece. Andrew played his king from d1 to c2, and now if I wanted to, I could have taken the piece with g5, but I decided that he might get a bit of counterplay by sacrificing a piece, and I thought it was more thematic just to round up the pawn on d5 first. Meanwhile, the white minor pieces on the king's side have no scope at all. The bishop on f4 blocks out the knight on h3, and it can't come to g5 because of the pawn on h6. So I played my bishop from a6 to c4. White defended the pawn, rook h to d1. Knight from b8 to d7. White pawn came to a4. Actually, that's not a very good move, because it weakens the square b3. But in any case, it's very hard for white to find sensible moves in this position. Black knight came to c5, threatening bishop b3 check. White played rook d4, and the black bishop sailed into e2, threatening to give white another set of weak pawns on f3. So Andrew exchanged on e2. Bishop takes e2, rook takes e2 check, white king to d1, black rook from a8 to e8, threatening rook to e1 check, picking up a rook. So white was forced into the awkward move, rook from a1 to a3. Now white's position is a complete shambles. All his pieces are disorganised, and his pawns are very weak, and it's just a question of finding the right way of invading and destroying the white position. Now there came rook e1 check, king to c2, rook from e8 to e2 check, bishop to d2, rook to h1, coming round to pick off the weak kingside pawns, pawn to c4. The point of this move is to get the rook into play on the third rank. In any case, the pawn on h2 can't be defended. Rook takes pawn on h2. White pawn to a5, hoping for a bit of counterplay by invading black's second rank. Probably I didn't need to worry about that, but I was a bit short of time, so I decided to defend against this possibility, and I put my rook back on e7, black rook from e2 to e7. White exchanged on b6, a takes b6, a takes b6, and then played his pawn from g2 to g4. Black rook came from e7 to e4. White exchanged, as he must, and the knight on c5 recaptured. White rook went to f3. That's to defend the pawn on f2. And now I played pawn on g7 to g5, which completely immobilizes the white army. The last few moves aren't so important. White bishop to e3, black king to g6, white king to d3, black knight to c5 check, bishop takes knight, knight's pawn takes bishop, b6 takes c5, white rook to g3, knight takes pawn on g4, king to e2, king to h5, white king to e1, black knight to e5. Now there's a weak pawn on c4 as well. White king to f1, black king to h4, white knight to g1, black pawn to g4, white rook to c3, black king to g5, and then white finally resigned. He's 2 pawns down with no chances at all. Well, that's our first game. I think it's a very good demonstration of the dynamism concealed in black's position, and that was my first important game with this defence. Now, for our next illustrative game, we go to an international tournament played at the beginning of this year, 1977. Please set up the pieces in the starting position. Good. I hope you've got the pieces set up. Now for the second game. White was the Peruvian master, Orestes Rodriguez, and I was black. And at this stage in the tournament, Alicante, 1977, that's in Spain, Rodriguez was leading me by half a point, and I had to win this game to catch up, well, in fact to overtake him, and then to win the tournament. So I decided to choose the English defence, because it was the sharpest opening in my repertoire at the time. Here we go. Rodriguez white, first move, white pawn to d4. Black pawn to e6, again inviting the French defence. White played his pawn to c4. And after b6, black pawn to b6, we get the English defence again. White knight came to c3, black bishop to b7, white pawn to e4, black bishop to b4. Now, let's think about this position for a moment. The situation on the board in front of us looks a little bit like a Nimzo-Indian defence. We have the ideas of doubling white c-pawns, putting lateral pressure on the white pawn centre. All of these are ideas familiar from Nimzovich's defence of the queen's pawn, or the Nimzo-Indian. But there's a big difference in black's favour, in my opinion, and that is that the knight on g8 hasn't yet been committed to f6. The delay in the development of this knight means that black can use the time saved either to develop his queen's knight, move the queen and castle queenside more quickly, also that the knight in f6 can't be hit and chased back by a move like pawn to e5, and thirdly, that we have these striking moves like f5 and queen h4 available on the king's side. Well, that's a thematic digression. Now we'll get on with the game. White's fifth move, bishop from f1 to d3. Black pawn to f5. And now, instead of d5, as Andrew Whiteley chose, Rodriguez decided to support his pawn on e4 with his queen. But first of all, he wanted to weaken the dark squares on my king's side. So he could have played queen e2 in this position, but first of all he played his queen from d1 to h5 check. Actually, this doesn't make much difference. It's almost the same as queen e2. Anyway, black pawn to g6, white queen back to e2, and now the black knight came to f6. putting more pressure on the white pawn centre. This is a crucial position, and I think that here it might be an idea for you to switch off and think about it. You've got to decide what white should play in this particular position. Switch off now and take a think. White's problem here is to support his centre without making too many positional concessions. Now, a move like pawn to e5, or white pawn on e4 takes black pawn on f5, is clearly out of the question, because that opens the diagonal for black's queen's bishop, which would swoop down on g2 and capture the rook. Another important move is white pawn on f2 to f3. Let's take a look at that. Move the white pawn from f2 to f3. Now, this possibility was given by Leonard Barden in The Guardian on Saturday, June the 11th of this year. And it actually stems from one of P.N. Wallace's old games, which was played as black against the ex-world champion Mikhail Botvinnik, white, in a simultaneous display given by Botvinnik in 1967. Now, in my opinion, after white has played the move f3, black has two good choices. He should either play the knight on b8 to c6, or he should play his queen from d8 to e7. It's also possible to castle kingside at once after the white pawn has gone to f3, but I don't like that so much because of the weak and dark squares caused by the move queen h5 check. Let's note an important point here. If white had decided to play queen e2 without giving the check first of all, then we'd have exactly the same position before us, but with the black pawn on g7 instead of g6. And in that case, I think that castles for black, after white pawn has gone to f3, is a very valid alternative, because the dark squares around the king haven't been weakened. But in this particular position, after the white pawn has gone to f3, I would give preference to knight c6 or queen e7. In The Guardian, however, Len Barden made a very amusing mistake. He recommended, after the pawn has gone to f3, that black take on e4, black pawn takes white pawn e4, white pawn on f3 takes pawn on e4, and now the move he recommended was knight on f6 takes white pawn on e4, apparently winning a pawn. Can you see what's wrong with this? Switch off for a moment and think about it. Did you see the trap that the Guardian correspondent missed? White naturally plays bishop d3, takes knight on e4, and now black has two alternatives. One of them is queen on d8 to h4 check. Apparently this wins back the piece, because if pawn goes to g3, black simply takes on e4 with his queen. But white has the surprising move, king from e1 to d1. And as is quite clear, black now suffers from a ruinous loss of material. Please put the white king back on e1 and the black queen back on d8. Well, queen h4 check doesn't work. So you may say, the obvious thing to do is to insert bishop on b4 takes white knight on c3 check first. And if white recaptures, then queen h4 check will win the piece back. But again, white has a little trick. He just plays king d1. Now, material's level at the moment. In fact, black's a pawn ahead. But the trouble is, he can't prevent himself from losing a piece. If he moves the bishop on c3, he loses the bishop on b7. If he takes the bishop on e4, white recaptures, the bishop on c3 is still attacked, and the rook on a8 is hanging. and if he plays pawn from d7 to d5, white simply takes it, and black can't take back with the pawn in view of a discovered check. This neat trap wins a piece. Okay, let's put the pieces back on the squares where they ought to be. Black bishop from c3 goes to b4. The white king goes back from d1 to e1. White bishop on e4 goes to d3. And now we'll replace some pieces on the board. A white knight on c3. White pawns on e4 and f3. Black pawn on f5. And black knight on f6. Now, that's what happens if white decides to reinforce his centre by moving his pawn from f2 to f3. Please put the pawn back from f3 to f2, and we'll look at the move played by Rodriguez. This was bishop from c1 to g5. Actually, Leonard Barden recommended this move in The Guardian, thinking that f3 lost a pawn for nothing. But in fact, bishop g5 is a mistake, which gives white much the worse game, whereas f3 was, in my opinion, still unclear. After bishop g5, black took on e4 with his pawn. Pawn f5 takes white pawn e4. Now, think about this position for a while, and try and work out what happens if white plays bishop d3 takes pawn on e4. Here are the main variations after bishop d3 takes pawn on e4. They go bishop b4 takes white knight c3 check. White recaptures on c3. Pawn takes bishop. Bishop b7 takes white bishop e4. White bishop on g5 takes black knight on f6. Black queen takes back on f6. White plays queen takes bishop on e4. Black knight goes to c6. White knight goes to f3. Black castles, kingside. White castles, kingside. And now black has the very good move, queen on f6 to f4, offering transposition into an endgame. If white takes the endgame, he has to play a position where black has very active play on the f-file, and also his pawns on the queen side have been weakened. And if he avoids the endgame with some such move as queen to c2, or queen to d3, or queen to e2, then black will play his rook from f8 to f5, and bring the other rook to f8, and he'll start to arrange a massive attack on the king side with his triple pieces on the f-file. Okay, you can think about this for a while if you like, but when you've finally decided what's going on, please put the pieces back in the following way. White queen on e2. White king back to e1. White rook on f1 to h1. The knight from f3 hops back to g1. Black queen on f4 goes back to d8. Black knight on c6 goes back to b8. Black king to e8. Rook to h8. Pawn on c3 goes back to b2. And now we replace some pieces. Black pawn on f5. Black knight on f6. Black bishop on b4. White pawn on e4. White knight on c3. White bishop on d3. White bishop on g5. And now the monstrous beast itself, the bishop on b7. Right. Black played pawn f5 takes white pawn e4. And Rodriguez didn't like the look of the variations we just analysed, and he decided to sacrifice a pawn. Bishop from d3 to c2. Well, this pawn sacrifice isn't sound, and black soon got a winning position. The next moves were queen to e7, black queen to e7, white castle queenside. I hacked off his knight on c3 with my bishop, and he recaptured. pawn takes bishop on c3. Black knight went to c6. And now white tried to make a proper gambit of it by playing pawn to f3. But it was black who got the attack. Queen came to a3, check. King went to b1. Black castled kingside. And now white has the problem of looking after his weak pawn on c3. Rodriguez solved it, in a rather unsatisfactory way I might add, by sacrificing it to get some more play for his pieces. Although in this position I'd say that white is already quite lost. Bishop went to c1. Queen took pawn on c3. Bishop went to b2. Queen retreated to a5. Now there's a threat of knight b4 winning at once, so we had to take off a move to play a3, white pawn to a3. You can see that this isn't a very glorious double pawn sacrifice. Black pawn went to e5. White pawn went to d5, and the black knight jumped into d4. The only way for white to stay in the game now is to sacrifice the exchange, otherwise he's completely lost. So, rook takes d4, pawn takes d4, white pawn on f3 takes black pawn on e4. Now, you might care to think about this position for a while and try and work out the best move for black. Actually, I didn't find the best move. What I played was much too violent and let white get a few chances before he lost. Think about it and see if you can do better than I did. Probably the best move in this position is the simple pawn on c7 to c5, just cementing black's gains. And if white takes it en passant, recapture with the bishop, and follow up with rook on a8 to e8, when black is just the exchange ahead. Instead of this, I found a rather more complicated attacking operation. The black bishop went from b7 to a6. White played his knight to f3, and now I played b5, black pawn to b5, trying to rip open the b file. White played his pawn to c5, as he must, and I played pawn on b5 to b4. The only defence is queen from e2 to d2, pinning the pawn on b4, and now I played rook on a8 to b8. In this position, I think you should turn off for a while and consider what white's best chance is. He's the exchange down, but he still has some counterplay if he finds the right move. Turn off now and think about it. The only possible chance was to play his rook on h1 to c1. It's a rather arcane move, but the idea is to get some counterplay on the c-file if ever black captures the pawn on c5. After that move, the position is still surprisingly unclear. In the game, if you played the white rook to c1, put it back on h1, white played his knight on f3, takes black pawn on d4. And now I've finished him off quite quickly. Black queen takes pawn on c5, knight went to b3, queen went to c4. Now there are two threats, pawn on e4 and pawn on a3. White had to play pawn to a4. Black knight took the pawn on e4. White recaptured, bishop takes e4. Queen takes e4, check. King a1. Queen to d3. White queen went to h6. That's the only move. He has to threaten mate to gain a tempo to save his knight. Black rook went to f7, stopping the mate, but still threatening the knight. Knight retreated to c1. Black queen went to e4. White rook went to d1. Black rook came to e8. White rook went to d4. Queen to e3, threatening the exchange of queens. White played his queen to h4. but the black rook came to f1, after which white had no alternative but to resign. So, that's the second of our illustrative games. Now, please set up all the pieces in the starting position, and we'll go over one or two brief lines of analysis to conclude this tape on the English defence. This final analysis may be a bit haphazard, but I hope that it will prove a fruitful research ground for your own ideas and games. If you've got the pieces in the starting position, let's shoot. White pawn to d4, black pawn to e6, white pawn to c4, black pawn to b6, white pawn to e4, black bishop to b7. Now, a very important move for white in this position is to support his pawn centre with f3. That's to blot out the bishop on b7. Another idea, put the pawn back from f3 to f2, is to play the pawn from d4 to d5. But in that case, I think black can reply with bishop b4 check and get a very playable position. Okay, put the pawn back from d5 to d4, the bishop back from b4 to f8, and replace the white pawn from f2 to f3. Now, in this position there are several ideas. One of them is to play the bishop from f8 to b4 check. White will play something like bishop d2 or knight c3. Then you play the queen from d8 to h4 check. White has to play his pawn to g3. You then exchange either on d2 or c3, depending on what move white played. Drop your queen back to h5, and then continue the struggle against white's pawn centre with some such move like f5, trying to batter open the long diagonal for your queen's bishop. Please replace the black queen on d8, the black bishop on f8, put the white pawn back from g3 to g2, the white knight back on b1, and white bishop back on c1. Also, instead of playing queen h4 check or bishop b4 check, black can reply to f3 on the fourth move with the move f5. I've had this in several of my own games, and it involves an interesting gambit. For example, my game with Sazonko, white, the Dutch Grandmaster, from Bad Lauterberg earlier this year, went pawn to f5, white captured on f5 with his pawn, and black took back with his pawn. White knight went from g1 to h3, black bishop went from f8 to b4 check, white knight went to c3, black queen came to h4 check, white pawn went to g3, black queen went to e7 check, white king went to f2. That's forced, by the way. Black bishop took on c3, and white recaptured, b2 takes c3. And now I played my knight from b8 to c6. The idea is to castle queenside very quickly. Another plan is to play knight a5 and bishop a6. And my idea, if white had played bishop from f1 to d3, was to castle queenside and sacrifice the pawn on f5, just to get the open f-file for a rook. That's a positional gambit. It may appeal to you or it may not, but I thought it was quite playable. Please put white's bishop back on f1, put black's king back on e8, and put black's queen's rook back on a8. In the game, Sazonko played his bishop from c1 to f4. I castled queenside. He played his pawn to d5, and I played knight e5. In this position, black has a thoroughly satisfactory game. In fact, he may even stand slightly better. And the game was later drawn, although possibly I missed some chances. Now, let's go right back to the beginning again. Please set up the pieces in the original position. Okay, pieces in the original position, let's start again. Let's do it by a different move order this time. White pawn to c4, black pawn to b6, white pawn to d4, black pawn to e6, white pawn to e4, black bishop to b7, white knight to c3, black bishop to b4, white queen to c2. Now, Tony Miles had a bit of trouble against this move a couple of years ago, when Jonathan Spielman beat him with it in the British Championship. But in those days, Miles was taking off on c3 check immediately, and then playing slowly with moves like d6 and knight e7. The right move for black in this position is the surprising queen on d8 to h4, striking sideways at white's pawn centre. Now, I discovered this move independently last year, and I showed it to Tony Miles during the Haifa Olympiad. And to my chagrin, I must admit, he got in with it first and beat the Hungarian Grandmaster Farragut with it in his game at Hastings earlier this year. The point is that after bishop d3, bishop from f1 to d3, black pawn to f5, white knight to f3, black has the surprising trick, bishop on b4 takes c3 check, and however white recaptures, the move queen h4 to g4 will win material, because of the pressure against e4 and g2. In the game, Farragut played more passively, but still white got a very bad position. Cut. For the full game between Farragut and Miles, using my idea, please consult the accompanying pamphlet. It also seems, however, that queen h4 in that position was discovered by Wallace in his games from the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 1960s that is. So, although I discovered the idea myself, I can't claim total credit for it. That's a shame. Now, the final episode on this tape will deal with the latest game in this variation, where Tony Miles tried out the idea against world champion Karpov in the tournament at Las Palmas a couple of weeks ago. Now, please set up your pieces in the starting position. This game was also quoted by Leonard Barden in his Guardian article of Saturday, June the 11th, and he thought that this game might prove the death of the English defence. Well, I don't think the English defence is as easy to refute as that. Let's have a go. Karpov white, Miles black, white pawn to c4, black pawn to b6, white pawn to d4. And now Tony played his bishop to b7. Personally, I think the most accurate move order here is to play the pawn to e6 at once. Let's take a look. Black pawn goes to e6. Now, if white plays his pawn to d5, which was Karpov's plan in the game, black plays knight g8 to f6, and if white plays his knight to c3, there's the pin, bishop b4. Black has a good game. So please put white's knight back on b1. If white plays his pawn to a3, in preparation for knight c3, black has the move bishop c8 to a6, which is really very annoying for white. This is one reason why I consider it more accurate to delay the development of black's queen's bishop to b7. Anyway, let's now take a look at the move order adopted by Tony. I think that's playable too. Let's put the pieces back in the starting position. White played his pawn to c4, black pawn went to b6, white played d4, and the black bishop went to b7. And now Karpov played d5 to shut the bishop out of play. Tony played e6, and now there came a3. In this position, bishop a6 is a lot less effective. For a start, black's wasted a tempo. Secondly, white can reply with e4, which wasn't the case with the black knight on f6. What Tony now played was knight f6, but I think we have to take a look instead of this at queen from d8 to h4, attacking the white pawn on c4. One possible example is queen to h4, white pawn to e3, black knight to f6, white knight to f3, black queen to h5, and black has a lot of pressure against white's pawn on d5. Also, it's very hard to annoy the queen on this strange square h5. Put black's queen back on h4, and the white knight back on g1. Instead of knight f3, another move is knight from b1 to c3. But now black has to play knight f6 to e4, threatening knight takes c3 and knight takes f2. White takes on e4, and black takes back with the queen. And once again, black has rather an active position. It's very hard to dislodge the queen without making pawn weaknesses, and meanwhile black has a lot of pressure against white's pawns on d5 and c4. I think there's a lot of there's a great field for research here. I'm not going to go into the variations in detail, and I'll let you do some home analysis yourself on this. Now let's take a quick look at Karpov-Miles itself. Go back to the starting position. Put white pawns on c4 and d4, black pawn on b6, and black bishop on b7. White played his pawn to d5, black played his pawn to e6, white pawn went to a3, black knight went to f6, that's the mistake in my opinion, white knight went to c3, black bishop went to d6, white knight went to f3, black pawn took on d5, white pawn took on d5, black castled, white played bishop g5, black went rook e8, white played e3, black played his bishop to e7, and the white bishop came to c4. Now, it seems to me that this is the classic position black should avoid. White's managed to overprotect the pawn on d5, the bishop on b7's out of play. It's very hard for black to develop his queenside pieces. White's generally got more space, while obviously superior position. And in fact, Karpov went on to win very convincingly in 34 moves. So, you shouldn't play like that. Let's go back to the starting position again. Starting position, white plays pawn to d4, black plays his pawn to e6, white pawn to c4, black pawn to b6. Now, the only way white can try and steer for the Karpov variation is by playing his pawn to a3 at once. White pawn goes to a3. Now, black can have two choices here to avoid the sort of mess Miles got into. One of them is to play his knight from g8 to f6, and after the knight goes to c3, to play d5. This gives a quite acceptable version of the Queen's Gambit, where white has played the unnecessary move a3. That's not to say the move a3 is useless, but it's not strictly necessary. The defect of black's position is that he's committed himself rather early to b6 for a Queen's Gambit. Anyway, I think this position should be quite playable for black, and it gives black a much greater foothold in the centre than Miles got. Okay, put the black knight back on g8, black pawn back on d7 from d5, white knight back on b1. Another idea for black, on move 3, after white's pawn's gone to a3, is to play d5 immediately, which is pretty much the same as the previous example. Or finally, he could play his pawn from c7 to c5. And after white plays his pawn to d5, which is the most likely reply, he can take off with his pawn, white takes back with his pawn, and now knight f6. This is a kind of modern Benoni position, while white has played the unusual move a3, and black has played the unusual move b6. I don't know whether you like this kind of position for black or not, but in any case, it should also be playable. With that happy thought, I have to leave you. I hope that this tape has given you some new and interesting ideas into an opening that really isn't documented by theory. It's also shown you a few of our our leading players in action with this new defence, and also I've managed to show that in what's been written about the defence by the experts, that not all the tricks have been spotted. So, good luck if you play it.